Now, let me introduce to you this character. Mark Naison is a professor of African American Studies and History at Fordham University and director of Fordham's Urban Studies program. He's the author of 3 books and over 100 articles on African American history, urban history, and the history of sports. When not doing historical research, Naison likes to play tennis, golf, and basketball, and makes periodic forays into the media. He has appeared on the O'Reilly Factor, the Discovery Channel's greatest American competition, as Dr. King's having, and on the Dave Chappelle Show, where his performance has been preserved on that show's second-year DVD. He also has a blog called With a Brooklyn Accent, and he also is the co-founder, and there's a t-shirt right here, of the Badass Teachers Association. All over New York State, teaching and learning is being smothered by uncontrolled testing. The use of student test scores to evaluate schools and teachers, and the arbitrary imposition of new national standards, often called Common Core, without input from teachers, parents, and school administrators. The result is the largest test revolt in U.S. history, begun right here on Long Island in April of 2013, probably 1913, which promises to multiply in size this coming spring. Resentment of excessive testing in New York City schools also figured in the landslide margin amassed by Mayor Bill de Blasio. It is important that every citizen of the state have some understanding of the issues posed by school testing and use such information to evaluate candidates for every public office in the state, from the school board to governor. So please warmly welcome our speaker today, Dr. Mark Naison.
Okay, I'm so happy to be here because this is one of the smartest audiences I've ever addressed. The last time I was here was Occupy Wall Street, and now I'm going to talk about education. But there is actually a connection between the two, because Occupy Wall Street exposed the excessive concentration of wealth at the top layers of American society. We now have the largest concentration of wealth there since the late 19th century. And after Occupy Wall Street was evicted, that knowledge remains with us. And to understand what is going on in education today and why the Democratic Party in our state is imposing policies which are so destructive to teaching and learning, we have to understand something about the role that great wealth plays in shaping education policy, and why billionaires have more influence in the education policy of the Democratic Party than teachers. I'm going to name a few organizations. How many of you have heard of Democrats for Education Reform? DFER. Raise your hand if you've heard of DFER. One person. How many of you have heard of a group founded by Michelle Rhee called Students First? We're up to 10. How many of you have heard of a group called Stand for Children? How many of you have heard of the Gates Foundation? How many of you have heard of the Broad Foundation? All of these organizations, which command tens of millions, and in the case of the Gates Foundation, hundreds of millions of dollars, contribute to Democratic candidates and some Republican candidates to get them to evaluate schools based on student test scores, to get them to rate teachers based on student test scores, to get them to close allegedly failing schools on the basis of student test scores, to replace them with charter schools, and now increasingly to try to get schools to implement merit pay. And this group of funders has tremendous influence in the U.S. Department of Education, headed by Arne Duncan, who was never himself a teacher, and tremendous influence in the administration of Governor Andrew Cuomo. And the result of this has been a catastrophe on the ground, first seen in urban schools and now spreading to the suburbs. So look, why am I talking about this? I'm a professor of African American Studies and History. I'm not an education professor. It's because 8 years ago I was brought into the Bronx schools to talk about these amazing community history projects I was doing, which revealed that the Bronx was once a place of hope and opportunity for upwardly mobile Black and Latino families from Harlem, that it was a great place for those families to live in the 40s, 50s, and 60s before the fires, and it produced more varieties of popular music than any place in the world in those years. And people in the schools heard about it and brought me in to do community history projects. At one time, and this was about 6 years ago, 13 different schools devoted 2 months of the year to doing community history projects involving teachers, parents, security guards, the lunch people, the abuelas and the grandparents. The most amazing experience of my life in public schools, where everybody got excited. And then Mayor Bloomberg decided to impose school grades based on test scores, which were published in the press, and then began pushing to have teachers given evaluations based on yearly variations in test scores. The result of this was that every school in the Bronx which wanted to work with me said, "Mark, if we don't do 100% attention to test prep every spring, they're going to close us." Because part of Race to the Top, this is the federal program, was that if schools are low performing for a certain number of years, according to test scores, they have to be closed and 50% of their staffs removed. So what you had in the Bronx was a wave of panic going through schools where they couldn't do these community history projects, but then it got even worse. You started seeing teachers under medication for stress and anxiety, but the worst thing, which I found out 2 years ago, was that recess and gym were being turned into test prep in a place with the highest obesity rates in the city and in the state and maybe in the country. And so what you had was testing, school grades based on tests, teacher ratings based on tests, were making teachers hate their jobs, principals fear for their jobs, and resulting in what I consider child abuse on the ground level. This was in the Bronx, and nobody paid attention. Then our governor, who, by the way, his major advisor comes from an organization called Student First, and his Education Reform Commission has almost no teachers on it. And if they're teachers, they come from Teach for America, which is a program I would like to come back and talk to you about someday, because I think it has been doing more damage to education than almost anything we have out there. That's for another lecture. He decides to push through the legislature in the dead of night a law which requires that every school in the state now has to have a teacher evaluation plan, which has 40% has to be based on student test scores. So all of a sudden, again, I'm here in the Bronx and, occasionally in Brooklyn, where my wife is a principal, I'm getting these emails from Long Island, from upstate New York. Teachers are going crazy. They're working under terrible fear and stress. And when teachers are under stress, guess who it transmits to? The students and the parents. So all throughout the state, I'm getting like, my kids hate school from the parents. From the teachers, I can't do this anymore. And, this is not the job I signed. This is the best teachers, the veteran teachers. And then, this is a year ago, New York State decides to suddenly without any field testing, without any consultation, to align its tests to the National Common Core standards, and then score the test in such a way that they knew in advance 70% of the students in the state would fail. In Syracuse, 5% of the students passed. Is this the kind, and this was all done with the advanced knowledge because of the idea we have to make our students college and career ready sometime in the future to meet the demands of global competition. But how much stress and distress on the ground are you willing to accept or impose to achieve that goal? And what began to happen is already the amount of testing in the state was borderline abusive. In third grade last year, the ELA and math tests were 6 days and 90 minutes a day for third graders. There were also no exemptions given to ELL and special needs students. And then that's when I began to really, I mean, I'm already pretty angry, and when I get angry, I get really angry. But then I started to hear from the parents and teachers of special needs students who are being humiliated by this. And I want to read you a couple of things that I was sent. Well, these are all from Long Island. And this is it. I am a parent of 2 boys in the Southampton school district. One of them has an IEP. My child has had a rough transition to the new curriculum last year. He has accommodations, but as the rigorous demands increase, so did his attitude towards school decline. This culminated in a meeting with his pediatrician, principal, psychologist, and teacher. As a parent, I needed help. His attitude towards school was bordering and hateful. His anxiety level had reached such a level that he cried when I picked him up and fought for me to go in the morning. I had him tested by a psychologist. She had only seen anxiety level in his proportion once before in 20 years of practice. This I got a week ago when people knew I was speaking here. I'll read one more that I got. This is from last night. I have a friend who has a child in 2nd grade who is being destroyed by Common Core. There is suicide on the mother's side, and dad is worried about his son's mental health. He says he thinks he is stupid, dumb, hates school. Parents are at wit's end. They are in Riverhead School District, Aberquag Elementary School, trying to find some parents in his area, give them link to United Opt-out. These are the stories that I'm being told over and over again because of a top-down imposition of tests and curriculum without any consultation with teachers in the state, without having a debate and discussed in the school district, and without field testing. Now, what I would like to do is, I'm hearing this secondhand. I brought with me a retired teacher and a teacher from Suffolk County to talk to you, because I think the most important thing is a Q&A where we all talk about this together. Because what I'm hoping is you here will do what we in New York did and elect anti-testing Democrats to office, not people who take the corporate money and buy into the Kool-Aid. My first guest speaker is Terry Cow, a retired teacher from Eastern Long Island, and she's going to talk to you about the impact of the new testing, assessments, and Common Core in special needs students. Then I'm going to end with an upbeat speaker, Kevin Glenn, who's the founder of a group called Lace to the Top, which is an anti-testing group that's been formed in Long Island and New York State. And they're going to talk to you about what's really happening here in the schools of Suffolk County. Terry.